after that, after teaching them about this unknown God, Paul, you can imagine, living in or being in this godless city, probably wants to get out of there. But whatever, we see Paul departs from among them, not being persecuted. But again, the Spirit is probably working in Paul so that he moves on to the next city, which we see here in Acts chapter 18, verse 1. So let's start there. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth, and found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome, and came unto them. So there we begin to see some Jews being persecuted. But verse 3, and he was of the same craft, he abode with them, and wrought, for by their occupation they were tent makers. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. And when Silas and Timotheus were come from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the Spirit, and testified to the Jews that Jesus was Christ. And when they opposed themselves and blasphemed, he shook his raiment, and said unto them, Your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean. From henceforth I will go unto the Gentiles. And he departed thence, and entered into a certain man's house named Justus, one that worshipped God, whose house joined hard to the synagogue. And Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his house, and many of the Corinthians hearing believed, and were baptized. Then spake the Lord to Paul in the night by a vision, Be not afraid, but speak, and hold thy peace, for I am with thee, and no man shall set on thee to hurt thee, for I have much people in the city. And he continued there a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. So let's take a look at what happens here. Paul goes to Corinth. He meets Aquila and Priscilla, who are tent makers, and it says of the same craft. So Paul, too, in his probably younger ages as growing up, and his craft was making tents. He could sew really well. He knew how to use the needle and thread, and he knew how to make a proper tent that could keep the rain out and keep the sun off one's back. And so here he begins to live with them. He preaches in the synagogue every Sabbath. So we see that he is continuing to preach. But sadly, what we see here is that Paul loses support. He doesn't have the financial backing, the support that a preacher, a man of God, should have from the people. They should have been supporting him with their finances and caring for him in that way. And sadly, we see that Paul is not cared for that way, and he even eventually has to rebuke them for that. But God has a good plan for here. We can maybe assume that God is giving to Paul some rest in all of his travels and being chased around. It's a place for Silas and Timotheus to catch up with Paul, and eventually Paul has to leave from preaching in the synagogue and goes to the Gentiles as well. So we see that in the first part. In the second part that we read, we see about him going and worshiping in the house of a man named Justus, whose house was near the synagogue. And we also see Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with his house, and many Corinthians hearing believed and were baptized. So God is greatly blessing the work of Paul here in Corinth. God also comes to Paul and confirms him in his work. Be not afraid. Nothing bad will happen to you in this city. No man will hurt you, because I have many of my people in the city. God's people are there. So much so that Paul continues there a year and 6 months. Again, God's plan and his providence are here. So yes, Paul is not being paid and supported as a pastor. His needs are not being cared for as they should have been. But at the same time, here God is working so that Paul can continue, maybe rest, do some preaching, and work among the people in Corinth. So we see that there. Eventually, Paul will make his way back from Corinth. Aquila and Priscilla go with Paul. They go on to Ephesus, and then he travels from there to Caesarea, and then to Jerusalem, and then from Jerusalem back to Antioch. So that wraps up the second missionary journey of Paul, and we'll pick up the third missionary journey, the first part, in our next lesson.